Well, today is the Feast of Trumpets. And as John mentioned earlier, that I've been doing this for a little while. And it's nice to be able to do this. There used to be a time where you would get a lot of stress for being able to keep, for trying to keep these days. And right now, and when you look at the news, there's really nothing jumping off right now where there's any one particular religious figure that's getting a lot of attention, and hence the spillover of that once upon a time would fall over on us. And it's quiet and comfortable now. I appreciate that. So today being Trumpets is a day that's most associated with trumpets. And trumpets in the past, and the way Israel used them, was an alarm. Alarms today are configured differently in the way we see them. We don't necessarily see a trumpet as being an alarm. And in the past, a trumpet was an alarm as something that would point to war, and there was a reaction that was required. And in our society, again, that is not necessarily the case. Perhaps if we lived in Israel and we heard an alarm or a siren go off or a trumpet-like sound, you would think there's a Scud missile coming and you take action. Not such here. And even with most of us, when we grew up, we don't associate that type of alarm with war or anything of that nature. And most people aren't even familiar with some of the things that may have happened during World War II, where those alarms were typical. And it was a practice to gauge how you would respond if something were to happen. Even in movies, you heard an alarm and you would think Godzilla is coming. And people today, most kids, don't even know who Godzilla is. So again, we don't really have alarms, but we have a more passive form in alerts. But alerts, and I say passive, because an alert is a suggestion of action, not like an alarm that where you have to immediately respond. An alert may be something over our phones. It reminds you to do something if you so choose.
That's right.
An alert may be an announcement in a store that, attention shoppers, in 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, the store will be closing. And how many of us, when we hear that announcement, just keep shopping? It is not really something that you respond to. So when we hear that trumpets is an alarm, that kind of gives lend to how it doesn't hold a lot of sway in the way we think. In Leviticus 23, something that you typically hear read, and John mentioned it earlier, in verse 23, God is speaking a message that he would like Moses to relay to the people. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the 1st day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation." And we hear this over and over, and we are to associate these trumpets, these sounds, with an alarm that would prompt us to take action. Mm-hmm. When we see how these trumpets are used in Revelation, in chapter 8, if we could turn there. They often accompany things that aren't the most positive. And when you look at Revelation, it seems like a dark book, like a scary book, perhaps a horror story. And after a while, when you're in a period where you're hearing a lot of passages from Revelation, you don't walk away with the most cheery sunshine feeling. And that's the overcast of that book. But it's not the intention to scare anyone. Again, the whole purpose of this book, when you see some of the happenings that are taking place, it's meant to encourage people to change.
Yes.
But unfortunately, that's not what happens. So in chapter 8, in verse 2, we have a series of events that's being unfolded, that's being noted. And in verse 2, John writes, "And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God. And to them were given 7 trumpets. And as we see this progress, these trumpets are blown, and following it is a circumstance or a happening that takes place. Dropping down to verse 7, the first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. Again, not the most positive book, not the most encouraging thing to read, to have fire and blood mixed together and thrown down to the earth. What's taking place here, and what begins to take a series of things that continues to take place, is that God is speaking out and answering for the sins of the world. The way God sees the world, he doesn't look at people as individual entities separate from the greater sin that has cut us off from God. And he deals with humanity in the sense of there's a collective. So oftentimes the messages he may relay in different generations is seen as delivering it to a collective, to a oneness of a person. And the same thing with retributions and punishments. So many may go, well, that had nothing to do with me that happened in the past. That's not my problem. I was not responsible. Completely, one attempts to detach themselves from things that may have happened. And yet we can't necessarily do that. There's a cumulative effect, and we're all sharing in some of the things that God sees himself to be addressing, and that's what's happening here. It isn't just this society at that moment that just doesn't know how to act right. It's society from 6,000 years until that point in time. All the things they've done and the way that they lived is a reflection of how each generation lived in that time and that they were separated from God.
Right,
So what happens is this punishment is doled out. The punishment towards things that happened to those that did obey God and how they were mistreated. All of these things are being addressed. And also God would most prefer that people, when they engage in these things and have these things happen, would change. So the result of this first trumpet is a third of the trees are burned up and all green grass. And what this does is it destroys photosynthesis. It destroys crops. It destroys the ability of food to grow. And as each trumpet is blown, the things that are happening, it handicaps man's comfort in living. It handicaps man living, period. His ability to sustain himself is now troubled. Dropping down to verse 8. Then the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Here we have another occurrence, and what follows with this is that a third of all sea life dies. That's a prominent source of food for people. A third of ships are unable to operate appropriately, and thus they can't deliver goods to various parts of the world. Again, this is handicapping man's ability to live. And when you have the oceans turning into blood, again, a water source for various reasons is now not available to man. Again, as we go through these, each trumpet is affecting man in such a degree that people are dying. And once more, this is not the most positive, joyous Walt Disney World type of view. Dropping down to verse 10, then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. And that final sentence of verse 11, it continues, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter. So the next calamity that takes place is that water now, fresh water, is made poison. So we have the oceans that you can't facilitate into drinking water, and now the fresh water is something that you cannot use. And as it stated, many people died. Dropping down to the fourth trumpet in verse 12. Then the fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them were darkened. A third of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. So in conjunction with some of the things in the environment, now there's less light, and man is having a harder and harder time being able to function, to feed himself. And hence, people are dying. And once more, not the most positive thing in the world. It doesn't give you the most comfortable feeling. And as this is happening, we're not told how much time is passing between each trumpet. But when these things begin to take place, there's roughly about a year and a half or so before everything comes to a close in man's time span of being able to make decisions for himself apart from God. And that's an odd feeling. We don't have this sense of anything ending. Life is always going to go on, so we see it, decades and generations. Even when you watch sports, it could be the slightest of achievements on the field, and someone will commemorate it in the sense of this is for history. And in the future, people aren't going to remember. I don't even remember, and I love football. I don't remember who won the Super Bowl last year. You just forget these things, and people have this kind of limited sense of what history really is and what they remember. So as we see, the diseases and the retributions continue to fall, and yet people, again, still don't change. They don't repent. They don't alter their behaviors. I want to drop down to the fifth seal, or rather to the fifth trumpet. Let's see, in verse 12, that's 6, that 1:5, and that's verse 9. When he opened the fifth seal, that's the seal on my trumpet.
Chapter 9.
All right, flip the page over by mistake. All right. Here we go, chapter 9, thank you, Mark. Chapter 9, verse 1, the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star falling from heaven to earth. To him was given the key to the bottomless pit, and he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke arose out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace. So the sun and the air were darkened because of the smoke of the pit. And once more, the descriptions of what is happening and what man is dealing with is very dark. And this is to picture how the distance that's created between man and God, how that environment affects us. It is dark. They're a reflection of our spiritual state. It's gloomy, and that's something that needs to be reverted. There needs to be more light so that man can see and be aware of the way we're supposed to be living, and that's how light is often pictured. As we continue through this chapter and you drop down, you begin to see that something else is taking shape, and that another course of action that unfolds from these trumpets may reflect biological warfare. We have situations where people are unable to function in a certain capacity that may be related to biological weapons. If we were to try to fill in the blanks, so to speak, we might guess that what is happening is the beast power, the man that is portraying himself to be God, has a following by many countries and many nations, but there are a group of the nations that will not kind of follow his lead. They may not attribute him the status of being God. And though many of those nations may be the nations to the east, like Asia and the Middle East, and they haven't had a strong history of Christianity, and they oppose the beast power. And so he unleashes these items of biological weapons, and the description, as you continue to read it, might very well be a description of helicopters, and the inclined trail that is released from helicopters is being described when it's talking of hair or woman's hair, the face of these locusts, when you have a group of helicopters flying information in the distance, that's what they may look like.
Yeah.
And the weapons that they're unleashing, this is the effect that they're having on people.
Mhm.
Dropping down to verse 13, we then have the sixth trumpet sounded, and this would very well be the retaliation of those countries. This period of biological warfare, the effects of that seems to have a time period of about 5 months or so, just in the recuperation period from these things that have been unleashed. So I mentioned before, there's no sense of how much time is going by within that year and a half that's left for mankind to choose his way in what God has allowed him to do. But we see 5 months passed in just that alone. And then when we come into the sixth trumpet, there, as you continue to read through that chapter, there's a comment of how or it may have been the prior chapter, excuse me, where there's a comment of how that those weaponries are not to hurt the grass. So early in the first trumpet, all green grass had been destroyed, burned up. And here, in that prior chapter, is a comment that this weapon is not to hurt the grass, meaning that it's grown back by this point in time. So that amount of time has passed where grass can grow back. This is an elongated period of time where God is shaking the earth, trying to get some sense into mankind.
Mhm.
And it's severe in that people are dying and still not changing.
Yes.
That's so.
This period of time is also referred to as the day of the Lord
Mhm.
in Scripture in the Old Testament and other prophecies. But the day of the Lord is not a day. It's an elongated period where man is being prodded, rather forcefully prodded to change,
Yes.
and yet they don't.
Amen.
Amen.
So we have in verse 13 in chapter 19, then the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound to the great river Euphrates. So the four angels who have been prepared for the hour and day and month and year were released to kill a third of mankind. And again, another unpositive note is unfolded. And what you have are angels that are released from keeping situations and calamities at bay from happening prior. They're now stepping back and they're going to let things take place. Certain political strategies, certain military maneuvers are now allowed to happen in such result that what may very well play out is a picture of nuclear war. There's a comment of how much time is allowed for this period of time, and it is simply an hour, where a third of man is killed. This war that takes place is a combination of those forces from Asia, from the Middle East, now responding to that beast power. And there's 200 million in troops. That's a lot of people. And as a result of this war, this exchange of probably nuclear weaponry, a third of all mankind is killed. I don't know if that's including the 200 million, because as the story plays out, those 200 million die as well.
Yep.
And so then we jump over to chapter 11 in verse 15. Then the seventh angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever.
Amen.
The day of trumpets is a day that may actually have many meanings, just like the other holy days that preceded it. There are other things to understand beyond the more primary capacities, the more primary influences in those days. And here again, we see one of the primary influences, and that the kingdoms of this world are now going to be handed back to Christ, where Christ can now lead the world and how we're supposed to be living.
Amen.
That's a big improvement, and that's certainly something of note. And yet there are other things to to recognize. Given that was the seventh trump, many often lead to, in the next step, is the resurrection. But again, there are other things. And I would say, it's just a moment, slow down. Not so fast. Before you could get to the resurrection, there are other things that we would have to address or recognize. Oftentimes the people that I work with, I speak about my job, there are times where I have to, or the people that I have working with me, we have to try to rehabilitate individuals. And in that rehabilitation, you try to encourage people to work. And a lot of these individuals have never worked before. They've never held a job. And when they are given an opportunity to work, a lot of times their attitude and their response is, I can't do that. That's not enough money. And your response is, you've never worked before. You really need the money. Because they're in a situation where they do. And their attitude is, that's not good enough. There are not enough benefits. I'm not making enough. I don't have an office. They're looking for perks. And you're trying to convince them, you don't have a skill set for you to even command those things. You're trying to get to level 10. You didn't even do level 1 yet. There are other things to do.
That's right.
And in that mentality, you have to walk before you can run.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have liquid food before you could have meat and something solid. And so as we go through these trumpets, before we jump to resurrection, there are other things that we might want to recognize and notice in how we look at the Feast of Trumpets and what we are to recognize the Feast of Trumpets would represent. So in doing that, eventually I'm going to turn to the Old Testament, and I'm going to first touch on a period where Israel was allowed to return back to the land of Judah after being in captivity in Persia and in Assyria. And so about 50 years afterwards, after being taken out of the land of Judah, there was a contingent of people that were allowed to go back and resettle the area, rebuild the temple, and rebuild Jerusalem. And in that day and time, when you look at the Old Testament, a lot of the names that we see, a lot of the books that are in the Bible right next to each other, a lot of these people were contemporaries. A lot of these people were familiar with each other. And we may not even recognize that, especially when you have to turn so many pages. We think that these individuals didn't know each other. They may have. They may have had different lifestyles, drastically different lifestyles. You may have one individual writing, and he may have been living in squalor, or may have been a prisoner. And then you have someone else that may have had a different situation, living in a little bit more class, or living in a certain degree more prestigiousness. But again, they're contemporaries. And in the same way, in our day, we may have things happening in California, wildfires burning. It doesn't affect us, but we're aware that this is going on. In like manner, some of these things that were happening in the Old Testament were things that were affecting everyone. They were all taken out of the land. They were all removed from their peoples and their ability to follow their religion in the way they would have wanted. And if you turn to Daniel chapter 9, Daniel chapter 9 and verse 24. We have a passage that shows that there was some information that was given to Daniel, and that I'm sure was also passed on to his contemporaries, and especially to that contingent of people that returned back to resettle Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city. There was a mentality that they had when they went back there to do that. And starting in verse 24 of chapter 9, we get a little insight into how some of them may have been thinking. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. So here we have a passage that is alluding that in a certain amount of time, the Messiah was going to come back. And that was something that was very pertinent to them. They're under the heel of all these other countries, and they want to see themselves reestablished. They want to be removed from being subjugated to some of these other countries. And here they are, looking forward to the Messiah returning in the same way that we would be doing in this day and time, looking forward to the Messiah coming as we're doing today and keeping the Feast of Trumpets. Mm-hmm. So, here we have a people that return back to Judah, that return back to the land, and their encouragement, what's motivating them is, if we rebuild this city, then the Messiah is going to come back. If we rebuild the temple, then the Messiah is going to come back. And that was about a span of 430 years at that point. But yet, encouragement enough. And so we turn over to Haggai in chapter 2. Sorry, guys. Let's turn to Haggai chapter 1. Haggai chapter 1, verse 3. Then the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, and this temple to lie in ruins? Now therefore, thus says the Lord of the hosts, consider your ways. What had happened was, when this contingent went back with this encouragement that they're going to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the city and the Messiah is going to return, they initially had a good go of things. They had a couple of bumps in the road and there were some issues, but they got the foundation laid in 2 years. And then 13 years passed and nothing took place. They didn't get anything done. There were some political issues, what we may compare to, say, political fights or lawsuits, and people stuck in court, in a sense. And so nothing moves forward. Maybe they want to build a jail in your neighborhood, and the community board is like, no, you're not going to do that. And it holds everything up. Maybe they want to build a home for troubled kids. Same thing. The community board says, you're not going to do that, and people complain, and things go to court, and they fight, and nothing moves. So that is a part of what happened. Another part of what was going on was that the people had gotten comfortable. They kind of fell asleep. They weren't really making a lot of moves toward preparing for the Messiah returning, because their mentality was it's going to be a while before he comes back. They got lulled into that kind of sleep, a sleep that we ourselves don't want to get lulled into as we commemorate Christ returning. Amen. And so God speaks to them and he questions, you guys, you've made homes for yourselves. You got the color TVs. You got in your car, you got the armor roll and the tires. You look forward to the next video game coming out. God of War, or Assassin's Creed, or whatever game people may be playing. You look forward to the next movie. You look forward to the next iPhone. All of these other interests that we have, and comforts, and things that we do to improve our home, to make the value of our property go up, to make our lawns manicured and nice. And yet, God is saying you guys didn't touch the temple. Your priorities are wrong. What's most important, what you're focusing on, that's right. You're not paying attention to that. And he took issue with that. And just the way they do, they fell asleep, they weren't aware of what was going on, and they figured Christ isn't coming, or rather the Messiah isn't coming. And their view of Messiah was a little off as well, but nonetheless, they were expecting someone to come to alleviate their situation. And when they saw, after laying that foundation in 2 years, that things hadn't changed, that the outward circumstances weren't moving in a direction that would make them think the Messiah was coming, they kind of started to slack a little bit. And the same thing can happen to us. We look around, it seems like everything is just continuing to go on the way it always does. Nothing is changing. And we may think, well, pay attention to politics, pay attention to current events. And then if we see something awry, well, then we'll hurry up and just try to get ourselves straight. And the problem is trying to figure out what to look for that you might think would be awry. It may not coincide with something actually following through towards Christ returning. And the mistake of that is we are to walk by faith, not by sight.
Yep.
We are to pay attention to things around us.
Yes. That's right.
But our intuition is not by what we're seeing.
Yeah.
It's
Amen.
by our faith. And in order to have faith, that's a spiritual quality. You got to do spiritual things to get it.
That's right.
You have to process that in a certain way. And in order to do that, we have to look to God.
Amen.
We have to pray. We have to study.
Yes.
Some fast on occasion.
Yes.
But even that is not enough.
Amen.
Prayer alone won't do it. There's a degree of action that's required.
Yes.
There's a degree of resistance. There's a degree
Yeah.
of endurance.
Yes.
There's a degree of continuance in what we're doing.
Amen.
And sometimes it isn't comfortable. And without that push, there's no spirit that's built up. We have to use the spirit to get more of these qualities.
Yes.
And that is all involved. And a lot of times that's not what we're doing. It's not enough to just come to church.
Amen.
Coming here is not good enough.
Yeah.
The world goes to church.
Yep.
How are we any different than them?
Mm-hmm.
How are we any different than what the world does? And they go to church and they come and they look nice and they put on nice clothes. That's not what this is about. It's not how you look.
Amen.
How are we any different than the typical Sunday church and Sister Johnson and those sweet pound cakes that she makes? We're no different if we're going to do that. There's a spiritual quality that takes place at home by ourselves
Yes.
that
Yes.
nobody else sees.
Amen.
That's what really matters.
Amen.
We're called out for behavior modification,
Yes.
nothing more. Not to look cute, and there's nothing wrong if you look cute as you do that, so long as you're doing it. We're called out to do that at home and not to focus on our material things. But there's nothing wrong if you have material things so long as you're doing that.
Yeah.
And that's the emphasis.
Amen.
And that's the mistake that many make. In Matthew 24, Matthew 24 and verse 45. Here we have a chapter where Christ is speaking about the end times, about the period of time that we were reading about where these trumpets were being blown and man was being afflicted and affected by certain environmental changes and changes that were shaping his ability to sustain himself. This same period of time, Christ is now speaking to the church primarily. This is not just a general talk. He's speaking to his disciples and to the church in the future that there's a certain behavior that you are to continue having as you prepare and wait for him to return in that environment at those times. In chapter 24, in verse 44, therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. At an hour you did not expect, in spite of how much you may watch what the European is doing, in spite of how much you may
Yes.
watch
Yes.
those Brits fight and argue about whether they should stay in the market or not,
True.
in March, in spite of how much you hear them worrying about whether their pound is going to drop after they pull out of the European Union, in spite of how much we may disagree or not disagree with some of the odd and strange things that we find our president to do sometimes, or whatever we may see in the news, that is not all that we're supposed to be focusing on.
Amen.
And so when Christ says to be ready, or as we continue to see to watch, there's more to that than just using vision
Amen.
in that verb.
Amen.
He continues on in verse 45. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Assuredly, I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour that he is not aware of. Here we have a follower of Christ, a person that comes to church, be it today, be it in the future prior to Christ returning, and yet in his personal life, not when he's here, not what kind of suits he's wearing. It's not about that, or how much he gave in the offering, or what kind of car he's driving, or what he does for a living, or whether he's educated, or how well he puts a prayer together at the beginning or the end of service. That isn't the issue. What's that issue is what he does when he goes home, and thereafter.
Yes.
The spiritual stuff. If he's not doing that, his behavior then will reflect it, because you can't do spiritual stuff without spirit. And you can't have spirit unless you get it from God.
Amen.
And if you don't have that exchange happening, then you can't function. And this individual is functioning in a way that is prompted by him going, I got a lot of time. And like the Israelites were going, we got 400 plus years, and nothing changed. They didn't make any progress in building their city and fortifying the walls and the church in the way they should have. And so when we look at ourselves, spiritual Israel, and our church, our mentality, our thinking, our vessel, ourselves that holds God's Spirit, and we don't work on that because we're going, we got a lot of time.
Yeah.
Nothing's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah.
And this servant, and recognize he is a servant, he is a member of the church. He begins to engage in drunkenness and hanging with drunkards. And drunkards and being drunk is often associated with a wrong mentality of living, a wrong mentality of religion. We have this woman that in Revelation 17, verse 5 through 6, that is pictured as riding on a beast. And this beast is her combining a conjunction and working with the political system at the time. And she would be a religious entity or power of the church that is going to have a lot of sway over people. And she is drunk with her ways and false ways of living and religion and thinking. And not just this, but even in common society, the way we carry ourselves. Dating, just that word alone is not the dating of yesterday. When somebody says they're dating, that word has a completely different meaning.
Yeah. True.
There's a lot going on. They're not just going out for milkshakes. It's more than that. And it didn't mean that before.
Yeah.
And a lot of us may be of an age where maybe that's not our game anymore. That's not the thing what we're practicing. We're not going out and sleeping around. Maybe some of us, that day has passed. To carry ourselves that way, if we're a little older and we're not kids. And still, just the same, you have to watch out for the way in which you live and the way in which you think. There's still an effort that you have to put forth to control your behavior.
Yes.
Because when you get sick, there isn't one way to get sick and pass away. The person that eats a little bit of salt and doesn't have high blood pressure can die from diabetes. The person that doesn't have diabetes can just as well have an aneurysm. There are other ways. So when we look at ourselves, because we're not young, because we're not sleeping around, because we're not wearing, skimpy clothes and running around and bringing all the boys to the yard and attracting the ladies and chasing them, you still got other things to look out for. And that contaminant, that what contaminates our thoughts and that exchange that oftentimes young people are attributed and following will contaminate our thoughts when we're older, when we're in our 40s, and when we're in our 60s. So we're all in jeopardy. And so we all have to watch out in how we live and not get drunk with the ways of this world, but be sober.
Amen.
Turning to Luke chapter 21. Christ again is speaking, and telling his disciples in the church to recognize what is important and how we ought to live and function. Chapter 34, but take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the cares of this life, and that day come on you unexpectedly. This is something we need to watch out for. In Revelation chapter 12, Revelation chapter 12 and verse 7, we have something that unfolds. And a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. But they did not prevail, nor was a place found in them in heaven any longer. There's something that's going to take place in the future, where Satan is again trying to get a foothold in how things work and getting more power and influence in the system of how things take place in heaven. And he's thinking he could even overthrow God and take him off his throne. And that's what he's attempting to do. And dropping down to verse 12, he's unsuccessful and he's kicked out of heaven. And then in verse 12 we read, therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. When we see this, when Satan comes down to the earth, his mentality is he has but a short time. He's going to recognize that he has just about a little over 3 years. And he's going to enact his sense of revenge and anger on the world. And it's when this begins to take place that the church is going to find themselves in a situation that will be trying and difficult. It is during this period of time that things will begin to move very quickly. In Matthew 24, verse 27, Christ says, for as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Not just will this be a moment that everyone is going to see, it's going to happen very quickly, like lightning flashing across the sky. And when that happens, people may find themselves unprepared. Matthew 24, verse 44. Drop down to verse 44. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you did not expect. Again, being ready is more than just watching the news. It's those things that we do at home to build up the spiritual power that we would get from God. In chapter 25, starting in verse 1, Christ begins to encourage people and remind them that there's a degree of preparedness that we need to focus on at this moment when things begin to happen quickly. In verse 1, then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now 5 of them were wise and 5 were foolish. All 10 are in the church. Those who were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them, but the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. All 10 are in the church. All 10 have vessels. All 10 have the capacity to have God's Spirit.
Yeah.
All 10 at some point had God's Spirit and worked with it. They're not non-Christians in that sense. They're not unfamiliar with the ways that they're supposed to be practicing. But while the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept, just like Israel back in the days of rebuilding the temple and in Jerusalem. Yep. They got tired. They fell asleep. They slept. And for about 13 years or so, they made no action in building that city and preparing for the Messiah to come. Just like we are supposed to prepare for the Messiah to come and get ourselves ready as the bride of Christ, we should not fall asleep the way they did. And the way that, unfortunately, the church is seemingly going to have happen. All 10 fell asleep. But 5 of them had oil and 5 didn't. Half of the church is out of order. Half of the church hardly has God's Spirit. Half of the church at this time when this happens, when they go home, they're not doing that stuff. They're not praying, they're not reading, they're not utilizing God's Spirit. You might not see it or know it when you see them at church. They look nice. Their shoes are shine. The ladies, they look pretty. And the dresses are all nice and creased and ruffled. You wouldn't be able to tell it's an inside thing. And on the inside, they're not using God's Spirit the way they're supposed to. Their vessels that hold God's lamps are empty.
Yeah.
Today, our vessels are ourselves.
Yes.
We are the vessel that holds God's lamp. That light is God's word.
Yeah.
That light is the same light that is the opposite of how dark the book was when I started reading out of Revelation. Dark and gloomy. We need God's light.
Amen.
And without God's Spirit, when things jump off, when Satan is thrown down and he sees he has a short amount of time, and he begins to put things into play, when that lightning flashes across the sky, there's no time. And if you don't have enough oil in your vessel, in your lamp, in yourself, if you don't have the Holy Spirit in your body working, in your mind, then God's light, God's word, you won't understand what to do. You won't be able to put things together.
Yep.
You won't be able to formulate how to respond and understand God's word. And so when the alarm, the sound, the trumpet, the announcement that Christ is coming is sounded at midnight, then all those virgins arose and they trimmed their lamps. They tried to put it together. They tried to put things in order. And 5 of them were capable of doing that because they had God's Spirit. The other 5, half of the church was unable. Half of the church will be unable. Half of the church is unable to do that. And that's what we're supposed to avoid. That's the situation we don't want to find ourselves in. And with that understanding, we could sum up what we were doing. We can now resume reading about those trumpets and finish up the 7th trumpet, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. That was read earlier. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 51. Behold, I tell you a mystery, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. The 7th trumpet sounds, and in conjunction with all the other things that this day may contain, recognizing that Christ comes back to the earth, recognizing that the governments of this world and the ways of this world, the way we carry ourselves, the way we think, our customs, our culture, all that would change and be replaced with God's government. We also see that there's a degree of change and consciousness in what we are doing to be ready to accompany Christ in carrying this out. It is also a period of renewal.
Yes. Yes.
A renewal in the sense of new beginnings
Amen.
and what will follow after Christ establishes his kingdom here on the Feast of Trumpets. Jewish tradition says that man was created on the Feast of Trumpets. Noah, when that ark landed and stayed still and dry ground was finally made available, that also was on the Feast of Trumpets. It's a time of renewal and change where man's government is removed and God's government is replacing that old government. And it's not just something that we recognize on the whole, it's something we recognize individually in our person, that God's government within ourselves is to change and be replaced within our mindset now as we prepare for what will happen. And these are all the aspects that we are to recognize on the Feast of Trumpets and put into place as we celebrate this day.